Hello, my name is Brad Ladwig and this is our poster called Photochemistry in Microflow Channel Reactors with Optical in-situ Sensing. Our rationale in designing and making this photoreactor is to take advantage of the intrinsic benefits of microreactors for photocatalytic reactions. And that is partly from having excellent control over the reaction, knowing exactly the residence time distribution, but also the ability to control, for example, the local temperature, the concentration, the penetration depth of light, and other factors like that that allow us to very carefully control a photochemical reaction. The demands or the ways in which microreactors are progressing means that there's more of a demand for in situ analytics. And that means that we want to know within the flow reactor exactly what are the local concentrations so that we can control the reactor better to get better productivity and especially to get better selectivity for complex chemical reactions. One way that we are going about trying to solve this problem is by using in situ optical sensors. So optical sensors are an excellent category of sensor because typically they don't interfere with the reaction, the progress, or the composition. And we obviously are dealing with microfluidic channels, so we want to have a miniaturized sensor. So what we're going to present is our concept of a miniaturized optical sensor. The benefits of having that is that we could have a multifunctional reactor that can possibly be used for different reactions within the same reactor, and eventually this should help us develop strategies or build methods that we can use to design multifunctional reactors that could be used to synthesize chemicals on demand, where we basically dial a molecule. That would be the ultimate. And one of the known benefits of microfluidic reactors is that they can easily be scaled up through a numbering up approach. A very important element of the concept that we are presenting is the in situ sensor. And so the way that this works is quite elegant. Firstly, we illuminate a small region of our reaction mixture with broad bands, so that means broad spectrum infrared light. This light passes through the reaction mixture, and depending on the chemical species that are present, some of those will absorb particular regions of that broad spectrum IR wavelengths. And that means that the spectrum of the light that is emitted or passes, that is present on the other side of the reaction mixture, is different. It has particular absorption bands. Now, because we want to have a cheap miniature sensor, it's not actually possible or desirable to have a spectrometer that measures the intensity of all different regions of the spectrum in such a small region. So what we do instead is insert a filter that filters out all of the spectrum except for a very narrow band, which typically corresponds to a region that shows a high contrast between our products and the reactants in the reaction that we're studying. And not only is it possible to have one filter, but because these filters can be made using silicon chip technologies, it's possible to make an array of filters that potentially select for different regions of the spectrum. And after the light has passed through that filter, then we can have very relatively cheap sensors that just measure the intensity of the light. They don't have to actually measure the wavelength anymore because it's been filtered down to a certain wavelength. And so they only need to measure the intensity at that wavelength. And this is the concept that we are pursuing in this project, in particular through our colleagues at the Uni Freiburg. And an additional degree of flexibility that they are building into these sensors is the concept of tunable filters. So these are filters that rely on a particular concept, and we can talk about this more in the chat session, to achieve the filtering. And by having a variable spacing in those filters, it's possible to have a variable filter. The microfluidic reactor that we have designed for this particular project is based on a conventional microfluidic reactor with an integrated heat exchanger that was previously designed in the Institute for Microprocess Engineering here at KIT, and it's been modified, especially on the top surface and on the bottom, to have a whole range of windows. And what that allows us to do in this particular configuration is to have 3 different illumination zones. So potentially we can use 3 different intensities of the same wavelength light, or we could even use different wavelength lights in each of these 3 zones. And in between each zone, we have built in the sensing regions. So these are the regions where we will illuminate with broadband infrared light and actually have our special sensors on the other side. A very nice feature is that we have this integrated 3-zone heat exchanger. So for each of the reaction zones, there's an individually controllable heat exchange zone that has its own inlet and outlet of cooling water or heating water, depending on what region we want to operate that part of the reactor in. When we look at a back view of the photoreactor, you can see the base plate, and shown in yellow are the placement of the infrared sensors. And what you can also see is the plate that integrates the heat exchangers, some of the sealing, and you can see they're shown very small, but the window material that we've used in the IR sensing regions is a specialist material, calcium fluoride, that has excellent IR transparency. In the main reaction regions, we have used high-grade quartz glass. If we look at a front view of the reactor, this allows us to see the meandering flow path in the 3 reaction zones and how they are spaced apart by the optical sensing zones. And you can see the very large quartz glass windows that cover the reaction zones, and the calcium fluoride glass that covers the IR sensing zones. Originally, when we submitted the abstract for this poster, we planned that the construction of our reactor would be complete and we would have experimental results to show at this conference. Unfortunately, due to the disruptions we've had this year, our reactor is still under construction. So to give you an indication of the way that we intend to use it, and also how we will complement our experimental results with simulations, I show you here one particular simulation that we have conducted looking at how we can use COMSOL to study the dynamic reaction, liquid phase reaction in the meandering flow pattern that corresponds to part of our reactor. This is a case study or a classic example that's available with COMSOL, and you can see the reference at the bottom of the screen there. To solve this model, a number of assumptions and simplifications need to be made, and those are listed here. And here you can see our results. So on the left side, we have a time-dependent kinetic study of the ibuprofen synthesis, and you can see that from the starting position, after a reasonably long period of time, the system equilibrates. And that is also shown by the change in colours that are shown in the 3D geometry in the middle of the slide. And on the right hand side, if we have a 2D cutaway plane, you can see how the concentration of ibuprofen changes with respect to time as it passes through the channel. So as this work proceeds, the next step is that we should get our reactor from the workshop soon, and we can commission that, and we will study a number of different photocatalytic reactions within it. The results from that, and in particular the fact that we can gather these in situ results, so we can measure the progress of the reaction several times within the flow field using our optical sensors. We then plan to study the same reactions as best we can, especially if we have to estimate some of the kinetic data using COMSOL, and try to validate those simulations using our experimental results that we've gathered in our reactor. And eventually, once we have a good model in COMSOL, we look to expand that to some more complex simulations. For example, looking at multi-phase flow or in particular Taylor flow. Thank you for visiting our poster here in this online AIChE annual meeting this year. We will be available for the chat that we have scheduled, and we very much hope to meet you there. We wish everyone participating in this AIChE annual meeting, virtual annual meeting this year, all the best, and we hope to speak with many of you. Thank you for your attention.